The sound of the bulldozer's engine roared to life, sending vibrations through the ground beneath Charles Miller's feet. He stood at the edge of his lakeside property, watching as the machine moved closer, its large metallic arm poised like an executioner's axe ready to strike. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic thumping drowning out the whir of the engine and the chaotic shouts from the workers. His gaze was locked on the bridge, his bridge, the one he had built from the ground up with his own two hands. Brick by brick, nail by nail. It had always been more than just a bridge. To Charles, it symbolized resilience, determination, and family, a link to his father, who had passed on his skills and love for building things that lasted. His father had always told him that building a solid foundation, both in life and work, was the key to everything. And now, as the bulldozer's metal teeth chewed into the bridge, he could feel that foundation being ripped apart, piece by piece. The hoe had demanded this. They had always found ways to control his every move, to remind him that no matter how long he lived here, how much he had invested in this land, he would never truly belong. They had tried to tear down his dignity for years, slowly chipping away at his sense of peace, trying to make him bend to their will. But this was the last straw. The board members, in their pristine suits, had ordered the demolition, citing some vague code about unauthorized structures and violations of community rules. They never seemed to care about the people they hurt, only about maintaining their image, their perfect little bubble. They didn't care about the years Charles had spent pouring his heart into his land, into his legacy. To them, he was just another black man with an unapproved bridge, an inconvenient symbol of something they couldn't control. Charles watched as the bulldozer's blades tore into the foundation of the bridge. His hands, clenched into fists at his sides, trembled with a mix of helplessness and anger. The roar of the engine seemed to grow louder, deafening in its intensity. The bridge groaned under the assault, the timber splintering, the metal posts bending, cracking like the remnants of his dreams. The workers operated with mechanical precision, uncaring for the history they were destroying. He had tried to fight it. He'd attended the meetings, spoken up, written letters, but it was always the same. The HOA's power was too great. They had money, influence, and the support of the community. They didn't need to listen to a man like him, a black man who had dared to challenge them. Charles' father had built that bridge, not just as a way to connect the land, but to represent the hard work of his ancestors, the generations that had fought to carve out a place in this world. Charles had inherited that dream, that desire to build something lasting, something real. But the hoe? They saw it as an eyesore, a symbol of defiance that didn't belong in their perfect, whitewashed world. As the last of the bridge collapsed into the water, Charles stood motionless, watching the destruction unfold before him. He wanted to shout, to run down there and stop them, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if his voice had been stolen along with his dreams, his sense of belonging. For a long moment, he felt small, insignificant in the face of their power. Then, something inside him snapped. A quiet rage began to build in the pit of his stomach, a simmering heat that surged through his veins like a wildfire. For years, he had held back, swallowed his anger, and played by their rules. He had been patient, but no more. He was done being a spectator in his own life. He was done being a victim of their arrogance. The time had come to take action. Charles turned on his heel and walked back toward his house, his mind racing. The destruction of the bridge was just the beginning. He could feel it deep inside. The wheels were turning. This was more than just a personal loss. This was about justice, about reclaiming what was rightfully his. As he walked past the remains of his father's bridge, Charles looked out over the water. The lake was still, reflecting the blue sky above, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if nothing had changed. But inside, Charles felt the storm brewing. He knew the hoe had made a mistake by underestimating him. They thought they could take everything from him and crush his spirit, but they didn't know him. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know what he was capable of when pushed to the edge. The hoe had made their first error when they took down the bridge, but their second, bigger mistake was thinking that Charles would quietly accept it. He wasn't that man. No. Charles had something they didn't. Something they could never take away. Power. He was going to show them what it really meant to mess with a black man who had nothing left to lose. Charles didn't need a bridge anymore. What he needed now was something far more potent. Something that would make them feel the same sense of helplessness he had felt when they destroyed his father's legacy. He had the power to destroy, to turn the tables. And now that power was going to be his weapon. The dam, the one that controlled the lake, was where it all began. If he could manipulate the flow of water, if he could tap into that pressure, he could make the HOA's $4 million resort feel the full weight of his revenge. Charles didn't know exactly how he was going to do it yet, but he was certain of one thing: the tables were about to turn. They would see what happens when you destroy a man's legacy. They would see how powerful a single act of defiance could be. With one last glance at the ruined bridge, Charles turned and walked toward his home, his mind already working, his body fueled by the fire of justice. The battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The days that followed were filled with silence. A heavy, almost oppressive silence that weighed down on Charles like a thick fog. The bridge was gone, but the sting of betrayal lingered in the air, sharp and undeniable. Charles spent most of his time pacing around his property, his mind constantly racing, piecing together the remnants of what had been destroyed. The pain of losing the bridge, his father's legacy, was still fresh, but something more potent had taken root inside him. A burning desire for justice, an urge to make the whole feel what he had felt. Charles wasn't a man who typically gave in to rage. He had learned early on that patience and persistence were the keys to survival in a world that constantly tried to push you down. But this was different. This was no longer about being patient. This was no longer about fitting into their world. This was about reclaiming what was his, about taking back his dignity, his space, and showing them that no matter how much money or power they had, they could never break him. The HOA had made a fatal mistake. They thought that by destroying the bridge, they could erase him, silence him, make him feel small. But in doing so, they had given him a power he had never realized he possessed, a power he was now going to use against them. Charles sat down at the edge of the lake, looking out over the water. His fingers traced the surface of the wooden dock, the remnants of the life he had built here. The lake had always been a place of peace, a sanctuary where he could find solace after long days of work. Now, it was a symbol of what had been taken from him. As he stared out at the water, an idea began to form, something that had been simmering beneath the surface ever since the bridge was destroyed. He had always been fascinated by the dam, the way it controlled the flow of water, the immense pressure it held back. The lake had always been an unpredictable force, but the dam kept it contained. And that containment, that control, was something Charles could manipulate. The HOA had built their resort on the land next to his, a $4 million investment that catered to the elite. Golf courses, spas, luxury villas, and everything else that screamed wealth and privilege. They had always looked down on him, a black man with modest means, a working-class individual who had the audacity to live beside them. But now, that resort, that symbol of their entitlement, was within his reach, and he would take it from them. Charles wasn't planning on flooding their resort, just to cause a little inconvenience. No, he wanted to make them feel the full impact of their actions, to make them understand the consequences of thinking they could tear down a black man's legacy without facing repercussions. The resort, with its sprawling pools and manicured lawns, would feel the full weight of the destruction they had brought upon his life. He spent the next few days observing the dam, studying the system with a precision that would make his father proud. He knew that the dam wasn't just a structure. It was a system, a balance between pressure, water levels, and release valves. He could feel the control, the power, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he could take it. He could tip that balance in his favor. He could use the lake, the very thing that had been the source of his peace, as the instrument of his revenge. Charles wasn't an engineer, but he was no stranger to understanding complex systems. His father had taught him to think critically, to break down problems and find solutions. And this was the biggest problem he had ever faced, one that would require all of his ingenuity, all of his knowledge, He didn't need to destroy the dam completely. That wasn't his goal. His goal was to release enough pressure to flood the resort, enough to send a message, to show them that they couldn't just erase him. He didn't need their approval, their permission, or their understanding. He had something far more valuable than that, the power to make them pay. As the days passed, Charles meticulously mapped out his plan. He would need to bypass the security systems, get access to the dam's control room, and manipulate the pressure points. It wouldn't be easy, and it would take time, but he was ready. He knew he had to be precise. One wrong move, one mistake, and everything could go horribly wrong. But Charles wasn't worried. He had spent his life in the shadows, never fully seen by the world, but that had taught him how to move quietly, how to think strategically. That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, Charles made his way to the dam. The darkness covered him like a cloak, allowing him to move unseen. The guards, who usually patrolled the area, were nowhere to be seen. They had no idea that someone was watching, that someone was plotting. Charles moved swiftly, his mind focused, his body in motion without a single wasted step. When he reached the control room, he paused for a moment, listening. The faint hum of machinery could be heard in the distance, the sound of water flowing through the dam. He took a deep breath, pushing down the adrenaline that was coursing through his veins. He was doing this. There was no turning back. With a swift movement, he bypassed the first security system, then the second. Each step brought him closer to the heart of the dam. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He had spent days studying the diagrams, memorizing the layout, and now it was time to put everything he had learned into action. Charles stood before the control panel, his fingers hovering over the buttons. The pressure was building, not just in the dam, but inside him. This was it. This was his moment. He pressed the button, releasing the first valve, and the water began to flow in a new direction. The pressure shifted, slowly at first, then with greater force. Charles watched as the lake's water level began to rise, and the realization hit him like a wave. He had done it. He had taken control. But as the water began to move, so did the gears of his plan. He had just opened the floodgates. The sound of the water cascading through the dam's altered pathways was almost melodic, a rhythmic pulse that echoed in the stillness of the night. Charles stood still, his breath shallow, as the first signs of his work began to take shape. The lake, which had always been calm, was now alive with a new energy, a force that had been held back for years, just waiting for its moment to surge forward. Charles knew the next few hours were crucial. The water he had released would take time to travel, but it was already starting to shift, to rise. He could picture it, the water slowly creeping up the banks of the resort, the lawns beginning to saturate, the foundation of their pride, their $4 million getaway, starting to give way to nature's raw power. He moved quickly, slipping through the shadows as he made his way back home. Every step felt heavy, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him. But there was no regret. There was no second guessing. This was justice, long overdue. For so long, Charles had been made to feel like an outsider in his own community, like his existence was something that could be bulldozed over whenever it suited the people who held the real power. But now, he was in control. The drive back to his house was a blur, his mind consumed by the unfolding scene at the resort. He could almost see the chaos, the confusion. The guests at the resort would be the first to feel the impact. They had no idea what was coming, and for a brief moment, Charles allowed himself to picture their reaction. Their luxury villas, their spas and pristine pools, all slowly succumbing to the rising tide of water. Back at his house, Charles sat by his window, watching the night sky. The stars, distant and untouchable, seemed to mock him. He had been trying to break free from their expectations, from the world that had always tried to box him in. Now, he had done it. He had taken the power back into his hands. But it wasn't over. The water would not be enough on its own to finish what he had started. He needed to make sure the message was clear. At first, it had been about revenge, about the destruction of the bridge, about the years of being treated like he didn't matter. But now it was about more than that. Now it was about empowerment. Charles wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every black man and woman who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had ever felt small in the face of an unjust world. The Ho had tried to crush him, but now they would know what it felt like to lose everything. The following morning, as dawn crept over the horizon, Charles watched as the first signs of chaos began to unfold. His phone buzzed incessantly, notifications flooding in from neighbors and news outlets. The dam, the very structure that had once contained the lake, was now being blamed for the flooding. Water was spilling over, flooding the resort's pristine lawns, and some of the villas were already underwater. Charles smiled, but there was no joy in it, no sense of satisfaction, just the cold, hard realization that this was only the beginning. He had created a storm, but the real work was just beginning. The Ho would be scrambling to save their resort, to save face, but they wouldn't succeed. They couldn't. By midday, Charles knew it was time to go public. He'd seen the news reports, heard the concerned phone calls from his neighbors. People were starting to ask questions, wondering how something like this could happen. The Ho, of course, was blaming the dam's outdated infrastructure, claiming that it was a natural disaster, a freak accident that nobody could have foreseen. Charles wasn't interested in the blame game. He didn't care about the PR damage the Ho would suffer. He didn't care about the money they would lose. What mattered now was the truth about what they had done to him, to his family, to his community. He picked up his phone, his hand steady as he typed out the message. It was simple, direct, and to the point. You took my legacy. You destroyed my father's work. Now it's time to face the consequences. The message was sent, and Charles felt a strange calm settle over him. He knew that the moment the Ho received that message, everything would change. They would know who had done this, who had brought their world crashing down. The power, once again, was in his hands. Across town, Brad Miller, the president of the Ho, was pacing back and forth in his office, his mind racing. The resort had suffered extensive damage, and the blame had quickly been placed on the faulty dam. But Brad knew the truth. He had known Charles for years, had watched him quietly go about his life, never causing trouble, never demanding attention. He had underestimated him. Now, as the realization began to settle in, Brad's anger flared. How could Charles do this? How could he have unleashed such destruction? The Ho had tried to play by the rules, had tried to maintain control, but now Charles was making them pay. Brad reached for his phone, dialing the emergency contact for the resort's crisis management team. The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. Mr. Miller, we're in the middle of a disaster here. The resort is flooding, and we can't stop it. The lake's water levels are rising faster than we anticipated. It's like the dam was tampered with. Brad's stomach churned. What do you mean tampered with? It looks like someone intentionally opened the floodgates. We're trying to figure out how, but we need to contain the damage. The guests are starting to panic. We can't let this get out of control. Brad's heart raced. He knew who had done this. He had no proof yet, but he didn't need it. Charles had always been unpredictable, but he had never imagined Charles would go this far. He had underestimated the depth of Charles' anger, his ability to take matters into his own hands. And now, Brad knew the Ho was about to pay the price. As the hours passed, Charles remained calm. The water was rising, and the resort was in chaos. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of control. His actions were creating a ripple effect, one that couldn't be ignored. The Ho would have to deal with the consequences. They would have to answer for what they had done to him. The message had been sent. The storm had been unleashed. And now, Charles was ready for the next step. The water would do its work, but it was time to take things a step further. He wasn't done yet. The true power of his revenge would come when he exposed them for what they really were: entitled, arrogant, and deeply out of touch with the world they had tried to dominate. The tide had shifted. The Ho had made their move, but now it was his turn to make them pay. The chaos at the resort grew by the hour. News outlets had picked up the story, and soon, the images of flooded villas, swamped golf courses, and swimming pools filled with murky water were broadcast to every corner of the community. Social media was ablaze with speculation. The Hoe, once untouchable in their wealth and influence, was suddenly facing an enemy they could not ignore. Charles watched from his porch as emergency vehicles and construction crews scrambled to mitigate the damage. The scene unfolding in front of him was surreal. It was like witnessing a carefully constructed house of cards tumble down with one swift gust of wind. But this wasn't a random disaster. It was deliberate. It was a reckoning. The HOA's response was predictable. Denial, damage control, and frantic attempts to salvage what was left of their image. They issued statements, claiming that the flooding was a freak accident, that the dam's failure was due to poor maintenance. Brad Miller, their president, was being hounded by reporters, his usually composed demeanor now replaced with frustration and fear. It was clear that the powerful elite were being forced to confront something they had never been forced to face before: accountability. Meanwhile, Charles stayed silent. He didn't need to add fuel to the fire. The message had already been sent, loud and clear. His actions had turned the tide, literally and figuratively. The press, the public, and even his neighbors had all taken notice. His quiet act of defiance was now the talk of the town. It was no longer just about the destruction of the bridge. It was about something far deeper, something more symbolic. The following evening, Charles received an unexpected visitor. His doorbell rang just as he was sitting down to a simple dinner. He wasn't surprised to see Brad Miller standing on his doorstep, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Charles," Brad said, his voice tight. "We need to talk." Charles didn't invite him in. He didn't need to. Instead, he stepped out onto the porch, leaning against the railing, his expression unreadable. "You've got something to say, Brad? I need to know what you're trying to accomplish here," Brad said, a mixture of anger and genuine confusion in his voice. "We're trying to handle the situation. We're trying to fix the resort. But what you did, this is not the way to handle things. You've destroyed everything. You've ruined people's lives." Charles stared at him, unfazed. "Your resort was built on the backs of people like me," he said, his voice calm but firm. "People who never had a chance. You think because you have money, because you have power, that you can erase a man's dignity? My father's legacy? You think you can just take from us without consequences? No, this is what happens when you step on people like me." Brad's face twisted with disbelief. "This isn't about some bridge, Charles. This is about the whole community. You've cost us millions of dollars. You've put lives at risk. You never cared about the community." Charles cut in, his tone sharper now. "You only care about your image, your fancy resort, your golf courses. You care about maintaining your status, your perfect little bubble, while people like me are told we don't belong. Well, I'm here to tell you, Brad, I do belong. And I'm not going to let you destroy what's mine just because you feel like it." Brad took a step forward, trying to maintain control, but it was clear that the situation was slipping away from him. "You've gone too far. This isn't the way to fix things. This is going to destroy everything." Charles looked him in the eye, unwavering. "It's already destroyed, Brad. It's been destroyed for a long time. I'm just the one who made you see it." There was a long pause between them. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Brad opened his mouth to say something, but Charles raised his hand, stopping him. "No more lies. No more pretending that everything's okay." As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the flooded resort, Charles stood by his window, watching. The water had receded for now, but the destruction was far from over. He knew the Hoe would retaliate. They would come at him with everything they had. But Charles was ready. He had already taken back what was his, and he wasn't going to stop now. The tension had only just begun to rise, and the real battle was still to come. The Hoe had underestimated him, but now they would have to face the consequences. They would never again look at Charles Miller as the man they could push around. He had made sure of that. The next few days were a blur of chaos, media frenzy, and relentless phone calls. The flooding at the resort had made headlines across the city, and the pressure on the Hoe was mounting by the hour. Brad Miller's face was plastered across news outlets, his every word scrutinized as the public demand for accountability grew louder. The HOA's attempts to downplay the damage, blaming faulty infrastructure and an unforeseen storm, weren't fooling anyone anymore. Everyone knew what had really happened. Everyone knew who was responsible. Charles had never been one for the spotlight. He wasn't a man who craved attention or glory. But in the wake of the flood, he had become a symbol, an unlikely hero, perhaps, but a symbol nonetheless. People were talking about him, whispering about his quiet defiance, about the way he had taken a stand against an unjust system. For the first time in his life, Charles felt seen, not for the color of his skin, not for his humble beginnings, but for his strength, his determination, his refusal to be silenced. As the weeks passed, the legal and media storm surrounding the HOA intensified. The company that had once prided itself on its wealth and exclusivity was now under investigation for negligence and poor management. They had failed to maintain the dam. But it wasn't just the dam they had neglected. It was the people they had ignored for so long. Charles had exposed their hypocrisy, their indifference to anyone who wasn't part of their world. But even as the legal system closed in on the HOA, Charles knew that the battle wasn't over. There was still the matter of the resort, their $4 million investment, their pride and joy. And Charles wasn't done yet. The moment of reckoning was coming. It was a quiet evening when Charles received the unexpected call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, too calm, and it sent a ripple of unease through him. "Mr. Miller," the voice began, "we need to discuss the next steps. This has gone too far." Charles recognized the voice immediately. It was Brad Miller, the president of the HOA. But this time, there was no arrogance in his tone, no smugness or condescension. The desperation in Brad's voice was palpable, and Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction at the turn of events. "I'm listening," Charles replied, his tone cool and collected. "You've made your point," Brad said, his words deliberate. "But we need to find a way to fix this. We've lost everything. The resort, our reputation. The town is in an uproar. The press is calling it a David versus Goliath story. We're at the brink of collapse, and we need your help. We're offering you a seat at the table. We'll make this right, Charles. We'll work something out. You won't have to fight this alone." For a moment, Charles was silent, taking in Brad's words. He had expected something like this, a last-ditch effort to appeal to his sense of fairness, to his desire for peace. But Charles knew better now. He knew that this was not a conversation about reconciliation. It was a conversation about control. "You think you can fix this by offering me a seat at your table?" Charles asked, his voice low, but full of conviction. "I've spent my whole life sitting at tables where I didn't belong, where my voice didn't matter. You think just because you offer me a seat, I'll forgive everything you've done? Everything your people have done? No, Brad. I'm not interested in your table. What I'm interested in is making sure you never forget what you did to me." Brad was quiet for a long moment, the words hanging in the air between them. "You're making a mistake," he said finally, his voice tinged with frustration. "This is your chance to come to the table, to be part of the solution." Charles took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "You had your chance, Brad. Now it's my turn. The only thing you need to understand is that there's nothing you can offer me that would make me forget what you've taken from me." Brad's voice grew more desperate, more pleading. "We'll lose everything. You'll destroy everything we built. People won't let this go. You've got to be reasonable." "I was reasonable for a long time," Charles replied, his voice steady, unwavering. "I played by your rules. I tried to fit into your world. But you didn't want me there, Brad. You wanted to tear me down. And now, you'll see what happens when you push a man too far." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Charles wondered if Brad had hung up. But then Brad spoke again, this time softer, quieter. "I don't know what you want, Charles. I really don't. But this is bigger than you and me. This is about the community. This is about more than just one man's fight." Charles leaned back in his chair, feeling the gravity of Brad's words. He could almost hear the fear in Brad's voice, The realization that he was powerless in this situation, that he had miscalculated everything. "I don't care about your community, Brad," Charles said. "I care about justice. I care about making sure you know the cost of treating people like me is invisible. You'll never get what you had back. The resort, the money, the status. It's all gone. You'll have to live with the consequences of your actions." With that, Charles hung up the phone. The decision made. He knew this was the point of no return, the turning point in the battle. He had exposed the HOA for what they were: fraudulent, entitled, and utterly disconnected from the people they claimed to serve. Charles didn't need their forgiveness or their approval. He had taken control, and now it was time to see the plan through to the end. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Charles stood by the lake, watching the colors shift across the sky. The water was still, the calm before the storm. But he knew that whatever happened next, whatever the HOA did to try and salvage their reputation, it would never erase the damage they had done to him. The final act of this story wasn't just about the flooding. It was about redemption, about proving that no matter how much power someone had, no matter how much wealth they controlled, they couldn't erase a man's dignity. And Charles had found his way to make sure they never forgot it. Justice was not a gift to be given. It was a force to be reckoned with. And Charles had become that force. The days following the call with Brad Miller passed in a strange blur. News outlets continued to report on the fallout from the flood. The HOAs scrambled to salvage what they could, and the slow unraveling of their pristine image. The resort was still reeling from the damage. And though the waters had mostly receded, the financial impact of the disaster was far from over. Charles stayed quiet, letting the HOA handle the cleanup, letting the media stir the pot. It was a tense waiting game. But Charles had patience. He knew what he had set in motion, and now it was time for the world to truly see who he was. But what Charles didn't expect was the sudden appearance of an old face at his door, a person who had been lurking in the background for years, someone who knew the truth about everything that had been going on, a visitor who would change everything. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across his front porch, there was a knock at his door. Charles had become accustomed to people showing up: investigators, reporters, neighbors trying to piece together what had really happened. But this knock was different. There was a familiarity to it, a weight that made him hesitate before answering. When he opened the door, his heart skipped a beat. Standing before him was a woman he hadn't seen in years: Alicia Matthews, his old neighbor from across the lake. She had been one of the few people who had shown any true kindness when he first moved into the neighborhood. Alicia was one of the only people who saw beyond the color of his skin, who welcomed him into the community, even as the HOA made their subtle attempts to keep him at arm's length. Alicia had always been kind, always a warm, open face in a sea of cold indifference. But what Charles didn't know was that Alicia had secrets that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the HOA, about the resort, and about the lengths to which they had gone to maintain control. "Alicia," Charles said, his voice a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here?" Alicia's expression was tense, her eyes filled with urgency. "We need to talk," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if to ensure no one was watching. "I have information that changes everything." Charles stepped aside, allowing her into the house. As soon as the door closed behind them, Alicia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she began. "But after what happened with the flood, after everything that's come to light, I couldn't keep quiet anymore." Charles sat down, his mind already racing. He had no idea what she was about to say, but he knew it was important. "What's going on, Alicia?" he asked, his voice steady, though his mind was on edge. "What do you know?" Alicia sat across from him, her eyes filled with conflict. "I've been working as a consultant for the HOA for years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know things, Charles. Things I should have told you a long time ago. I was part of it. I helped them manipulate the community, push the agenda to make sure people like you stayed on the outside." Charles felt a jolt of shock at her words, but he forced himself to stay calm. Alicia had always seemed like an ally. How could she have been part of this? Why would you help them? Charles asked, his voice tight. Alicia's eyes filled with shame. Because I was afraid. They had too much power. They controlled everything. The permits, the housing developments, the funding for the schools and public services. And when I saw how they were treating you, when I saw how they were systematically shutting out anyone who didn't fit their mold, I should have said something, but I stayed quiet. I kept my head down. Charles leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to come together. What are you saying, Alicia? What did they do? What do you know about the resort? Alicia hesitated, her gaze shifting to the floor. I'm not proud of what I did, but I think you need to know the truth. The resort, the HOA, they've been using the community's resources to fund illegal operations, and it goes beyond just the flood. The resort was built on land that wasn't legally theirs. They were using influence and bribes to manipulate zoning laws, and they were squeezing out people like you who didn't fit their plans. They made a deal with developers to make sure only certain kinds of people lived in this area, people who could afford to fit their image. They were behind the push to take your bridge down. But it wasn't just about that bridge, Charles. It was about control. It was about keeping people like you in your place. The weight of her words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. He had always known there was something off about the way the HOA operated, but he never imagined it was this bad. His father's legacy, the bridge, the years of being treated as less than by the wealthy elites. It had all been part of a much bigger scheme. And the dam? Charles asked, his voice barely a whisper. Did they know? Alicia nodded slowly. They didn't know you'd be able to access it, but they knew the system was vulnerable. They'd been keeping it that way, hoping to avoid any kind of scrutiny. They thought they had you, Charles. They thought you were just another black man they could push around, but they underestimated you. Charles sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. The plan had been bigger than he ever realized. The HOA had orchestrated an entire campaign of exclusion and control, and he had been one of their many targets. But it wasn't just about the flood anymore. It was about everything they had stolen, everything they had tried to erase. Alicia's voice softened. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Charles. I can't change the past. But I wanted you to know the truth. I never wanted to be part of it, but I was. Charles looked at her, seeing her in a new light. No longer the kind, well-meaning neighbor, but a woman who had been complicit in the very system that had oppressed him for so long. But at the same time, he saw someone who was finally taking a step toward redemption. Someone who had come forward when it mattered most. I appreciate you telling me this, Charles said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of everything he had just learned. But this doesn't change what they did. It doesn't change the destruction they caused. It doesn't change what I'm going to do next. Alicia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know, but at least now you have the truth. You have the full picture. Charles stood up, his expression hardening with resolve. And now, I'm going to make sure they don't get away with it. The revelation was the final piece Charles needed. He had already begun to expose the HOA for their destruction. But now, with Alicia's confession, he understood the true scale of their corruption. This wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was about dismantling the system they had built to oppress people like him, people who dared to live on the margins of their world. The flood had only been the beginning. Now, the real battle was about to unfold. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, press conferences, and community meetings. The revelations about the HOA's illegal dealings were causing shockwaves throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Charles had not expected Alicia to come forward, but her confession had turned the tide in a way that none of them could have predicted. Her insider knowledge of the HOA's manipulation of the system, their bribes, and their backdoor dealings had changed everything. The HOA was no longer the untouchable force they once believed themselves to be. They were exposed, their grip on the community slipping with every passing hour. Charles could see the fear in the eyes of the HOA's board members as the media continued to press them for answers. The resort, once a symbol of their wealth and status, had become a liability, and the people who had lived their lives on the other side of the HOA's iron fist were no longer willing to remain silent. The world had shifted, and the powerful were now scrambling to save what was left of their carefully curated empire. Brad Miller, the president of the HOA, was losing his composure. The phone calls from reporters, the constant inquiries from legal teams, and the pressure from the community were pushing him to the brink. He had always been a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to maintain the image of perfection that the Ho had built over the years. But now, everything was unraveling. The resort was in shambles. The flood had exposed their corruption, and Alicia's confession had turned the community against them. Brad sat in his office, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. He had never felt so cornered. He had spent his life building wealth and influence, carefully cultivating an image of authority and respect. But now, it was all crumbling. The truth was out, and there was no way to stop it. He had to do damage control, fast. But as he scanned the reports and legal documents in front of him, a thought gnawed at him. There was one last card he could play, one last piece of leverage he could use to restore order. The resort, despite its flood damage, was still worth millions. It had been the HOA's pride and joy, and Brad wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. Meanwhile, Charles was no longer just a bystander to the events unfolding. He had become a force, the embodiment of resistance and justice in the face of years of oppression. It was time to make sure the Ho understood the full weight of their actions, and that meant taking the next step. Charles had spent the past few days consulting with his lawyer, gathering all the evidence Alicia had provided, and preparing for what he knew would be a long battle. The truth was now out in the open, but there were still legal battles to be fought, and he wasn't going to rest until the Ho paid for their years of abuse. The flood had been his statement, but now it was time to see this through to the end. He sat at his kitchen table one evening, going over the details of the case in front of him. There was no going back now. The HOA's empire was crumbling, and he was going to be the one to bring it down. But in doing so, he also had a message for the community, that no one, no matter their wealth or status, was untouchable. The struggle for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. The phone rang, pulling Charles from his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID and saw that it was his lawyer, a woman named Vanessa Rhodes, who had been working with him on this case since the beginning. "Charles, you need to prepare yourself," Vanessa said when he picked up. "I've just been in a meeting with the town council. The Ho is planning something big. They're offering to settle. They've made an official proposal for a compensation package, essentially a buyout of the land and a promise to rebuild the resort." Charles felt a cold chill run down his spine. What do they want in return? They want you to drop all charges, all claims. They're trying to contain this situation before it spirals further. They're willing to pay a large sum, but they're asking you to stand down. They know they can't avoid the legal fallout, but they're trying to avoid the public relations nightmare. Charles leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It wasn't an offer he had expected, but it didn't surprise him. The Ho was trying to buy their way out of this mess, to offer money in exchange for peace. They thought they could fix things with a check and a handshake, but Charles wasn't interested in their money. He wasn't doing this for a payout. He was doing this to make sure they understood that their actions had consequences. "I'm not taking their deal," Charles said firmly. "I don't need their money. I need justice." Vanessa was quiet for a moment before responding. "I figured you'd say that. But just so you know, this is a big gamble. They have a lot of influence, and they won't go down without a fight. You need to be ready for what's coming." "I'm ready," Charles said, his voice resolute. "They'll have to fight me every step of the way." The following days were filled with tense legal meetings and strategic discussions. Charles knew that the battle was far from over. The Ho had money, influence, and power on their side, but they no longer had control. Charles had taken that away from them, and now he was going to make sure they paid the price for their arrogance. Brad Miller wasn't giving up easily. The Ho had initiated a public relations campaign to shift the narrative, portraying themselves as victims of a rogue individual. They attempted to paint Charles as an angry, vindictive man who was using the flood as an excuse to destroy everything the Ho had worked for. They painted him as a man who had no respect for the community or its values. But Charles wasn't going to let them control the narrative. Charles made sure the media saw the truth. He provided interviews, spoke out about the years of injustice he had suffered, and made it clear that this wasn't just about one man's fight. It was about justice for every person who had been oppressed and marginalized by the HOA. He used his voice to shift the conversation, to make sure the world saw him for who he truly was. Not a villain, but a hero. As the legal battle raged on, Charles' resolve only grew stronger. The community began to rally behind him, offering support and solidarity. It wasn't just about the bridge anymore. It wasn't just about the resort. It was about something bigger, the fight for justice, for equality, for the right to be seen and heard. The HOA's world was crumbling. They had underestimated Charles. They had tried to erase him, but now they were facing the consequences of their own greed and corruption. The legal system was closing in. The public was turning against them, and Charles was ready to see this fight through to the end. This was his victory, his moment. The HOA had tried to destroy his legacy, but now they would watch as he built something even stronger in its place: justice. As the days passed, the reality of what Charles had started began to settle in. The court hearings were set, the media coverage relentless, and the community, once divided by privilege and power, was beginning to rally behind him. But even amidst the chaos, a part of him felt the weight of the emotional toll it was taking. This fight wasn't just about the bridge, or the resort, or the community. It was about something deeper, something personal. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his legacy, and his father's dream. For years, Charles had lived with a quiet sense of resignation. He had been the man who never complained, who kept his head down and worked hard, who did what was expected of him, always out of reach of the world that the HOA built, but never quite part of it. His bridge had been a symbol of his own quiet rebellion, a place where he could carve out a piece of the world that was his and his alone. But the HOA had taken that away. They had taken his connection to his father, to his past, and with it, they had made him feel less than. But the events that had unfolded in the past weeks had brought something back to life in Charles. It wasn't just anger, it was purpose. He had stood up for himself in a way he never had before, and with every move he made, every step forward, he had reclaimed a part of himself. The bridge had been destroyed, but in its place, he had built something far stronger, a foundation rooted in his own worth, his own pride, and his own resolve. That night, as he sat on the porch looking out at the lake, the quiet calm he had once known felt foreign. The water stretched out before him. The same lake that had once been a sanctuary, now a constant reminder of everything that had happened. The flood, the destruction, the battle he had fought, and was still fighting. But in the silence, Charles found a moment of peace. It wasn't about the outcome anymore. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about knowing that he had given everything to this fight, not just for the justice he deserved, but for the future of people like him. For everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. For every Black man and woman who had been silenced, erased, or forgotten. He had stood up and made them hear him, made them feel the weight of his defiance. And in doing so, he had shown the world the truth, that no one, no matter how powerful or privileged, could ever take away a man's dignity without facing the consequences. The following week, as the court date loomed closer, Charles felt the weight of everything he had fought for pressing down on him. The town council had officially launched an investigation into the HOA's dealings, and the legal battle was intensifying. The HOA's lawyers had pulled every trick in the book, trying to paint Charles as a man of reckless vengeance, someone who had crossed a line and gone too far. They tried to make him the villain in this story, to turn the narrative against him. But it was too late. The community had already seen the truth. They had seen how the HOA had manipulated the system, exploited their power, and systematically crushed anyone who didn't fit their image. And now, the people were fighting back. Charles had expected resistance from the powerful elite, but he hadn't expected the wave of support that had come from his neighbors, from the people who had once remained silent, from the voices of those who had suffered in the shadows. They were all standing with him now, and together, they were taking down the HOA, piece by piece. It was the night before the final hearing when Charles received a phone call that would change everything. "Charles," Vanessa's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I just wanted to let you know, the HOA is officially offering a settlement. They want to end this before it goes any further. Charles frowned, his heart pounding in his chest. What does that mean? What do they want in return? They're offering a significant sum of money, she explained. They'll pay for damages, rebuild the bridge, and restore the resort. They're offering you a seat on the new development board. They want to put this behind them. Charles sat back in his chair, absorbing the weight of Vanessa's words. It was everything they had fought for, everything they had demanded. But now, standing at the edge of victory, the decision wasn't so simple. He had expected a moment of triumph, a sense of satisfaction that would come with seeing the powerful fall. But instead, there was a sense of calm in his chest, a realization that had been creeping up on him over the past few weeks. This battle, this fight, had already given him more than money or power ever could. He had reclaimed his voice. He had stood up for himself and for every person who had ever been pushed aside. That was enough. I don't want their money, Charles said, his voice firm. I don't want their position on their board. I want them to face the consequences. I want them to know what it feels like to lose everything, not just money, but power. I want them to understand that no one, no matter who they are, is above the law. Vanessa was silent for a moment before she spoke again. Are you sure? This could be your chance to make sure it never happens again. To rebuild the community. Charles took a deep breath. I've already rebuilt it, Vanessa. I've already made sure that they know what happens when you take away someone's dignity. They'll have to answer to the law, and they'll have to answer to the people. The rest will take care of itself. The next day, Charles stood before the court. The HOA's representatives were on the opposite side, their smug faces replaced by a look of desperation. The settlement offer had been rejected. The fight was on. And this time, Charles wasn't alone. He had the community behind him, and the truth on his side. As the judge called the court into session, Charles felt a sense of quiet pride wash over him. He had come to this moment as a man who had been beaten down and silenced. But now he was a man who had reclaimed everything they had tried to take from him. He was a man who had found his voice, his strength, and his power. The judge began the proceedings, but Charles barely heard the words. He was focused on something else now. He was focused on the future he had fought for. The future where no one, no matter their background, their color, or their wealth, could ever take away the power of a man who refused to be silenced. Justice had been served, not through the courts, but through the courage of one man who refused to let them forget. The war wasn't over, but Charles had already won the most important battle of all. And that was enough. In the weeks following the court's decision, the air around Charles seemed to crackle with a new energy. The lawsuit was still ongoing, but now it was no longer just a legal battle. It was a movement. The community, once divided by privilege and silence, had come together in a way Charles never thought possible. People who had once remained passive observers were now speaking out, standing beside him, and demanding justice. Charles had become a symbol, not just of defiance, but of the strength that comes from standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. His quiet, persistent resistance had inspired others to find their voices, and in turn, they had lifted him up, made him realize that the fight he was waging wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to feel invisible, to feel like they didn't belong. As the legal battles continued, Charles found himself at the center of a new kind of fight. He had spent so many years quietly enduring the actions of the HOA, pretending that he could somehow fit into their world, pretending that he could play by their rules. But now, standing tall and unwavering, he saw just how much he had been holding back. There had always been power inside him, but it had taken this moment of injustice and rage, for him to finally tap into it. People came to him now, asking for advice, seeking his support. They had seen how he had turned the tide, how he had taken control of a situation that had seemed hopeless. They had watched as the whole crumbled, as their once unshakable authority faltered in the face of truth and resistance. One afternoon, as Charles walked through the neighborhood, he saw a group of young people gathered by the community center. They were talking animatedly, their voices full of excitement. energy, and purpose. Charles recognized some of them from his old days in the neighborhood. They were the kids who had grown up in the shadow of the HOA's power, the ones who had always felt like outsiders, like their voices didn't matter. But now, something was different. They weren't just talking, they were planning. They were organizing, and they were doing it with the same passion and fire that Charles had fought with all these years. As he approached, one of them, Jasmine, a bright young woman with fire in her eyes, spotted him and walked over. "Mr. Miller," she said with a wide grin, "we've been talking, and we want to do something. We want to make sure that what you started doesn't end here. We want to keep fighting." Charles felt a warmth spread through him. He had been so focused on the fight that he hadn't realized how far it had reached, how many people had been inspired by his defiance. He had started this battle for himself, for his father, for the things that had been taken from him. But now it was bigger than that. It was about everyone who had been overlooked, everyone who had been kept down by a system that didn't care about them. "That's the spirit," Charles said, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "This fight isn't over yet, but you don't need me to tell you